All right. My first question is, are you awake?
Yes.
No. Who answered no? All right. My name is Santamaria, and I'm a lead developer advocate at Dell. But I'm actually up here as a member of the DevOps community, and I wanted to just give everybody a chance to talk a little bit about our communities of practice. Now, how many people here have ever heard the term community of practice? Not many hands. All right, that's where we're going to start. But I have an idea that I really want to start with. But before we get to that, I have a little bit of history. I promise I'm going to keep this short because I'm not really one of those fans of like the About Me slide. So just so that you all know, while currently I am a developer advocate, I used to work at some startups, I worked at Rackspace. But before all of that, I was a researcher in education. And that's where I was introduced to this term community of practice. So today, that's what I want to introduce to you. But we're going to start out with an idea. And the idea is that at the heart of DevOps is a community of practice. We always talk about DevOps as a cultural transformation. Sometimes we talk about it as a tooling transformation, but in reality, it comes down to this idea that we are changing how our business works. In reality, that heart of that transformation, what makes a team move to that DevOps mindset, is the community that's built. In fact, one of the original researchers that defined the term community of practice, Wegner, specifically wrote, and I'm going to have to read it because I'm going to get it wrong if I don't, wrote that the knowledge of an organization lives in a constellation of communities of practice, each taking care of a specific aspect of the competence that the organization needs. That's DevOps, right? How do we make sure that DevOps is used in our organization? How do we make sure it's shared throughout our organization? It's all about the community that's there. So what do I mean by the term communities of practice? It's actually a very heavily researched term from the education world that bled over into our business practices. Originally, the definition was very heavily structured with formal meeting times, explicit descriptions of various roles. But as time has gone on, especially after the pandemic, after various other things, it's become looser. So now we start to see a more informal definition. So we have communities of practice appearing on forums, in Slack workspaces or Slack channels. Anybody here part of HangOps? Community of practice, right? That's another informal version. The underlying principles of the definition of communities of practice, though, is pretty standard, and it's still there. So let's take a look at my version of that definition, just because it's the one that I know. A community of practice is a group of people who all have some depth of expertise on a topic. They have a strong passion for that topic and gather together to share that passion and expertise with one another. So there are three main components of this definition. The three pillars of a community of practice are the relationships and interactions among people. That's the community. Then you have the actual knowledge, which is the domain. And the practice is the act of gathering together and sharing all of that knowledge. So let's break down my definition and just make sure we all understand where we're coming from. A group of people. This one might be obvious. What's this one? The community, yeah, us. This whole thing is the group of people, right? Then we have the depth of expertise on a topic, the domain itself. This next bit, the strong passion for the topic, actually partially defines the community and partially defines the domain itself. So you have to have this to have both of those things in a community of practice. But the last piece probably is the big one for DevOps. And that's the idea that we gather together to share. This is the practice. Now that we've defined what a community of practice is, Let's talk about what a community of practice is not. First things first, a community of practice, and you'll find I keep using just community, but I mean a community of practice here, is not a team. There are three main pieces that go with that pillar, but really you can break it down to who has agency and ownership of the group. Who makes the decisions about what the domain is? Who selects the people who are there? And who defines how you actually get together and do the thing? In a team, all of this is done by management. So you have the interviews that go on. You have all of the various decisions about who is on the team. The domain is defined by the business need, what exactly we're working on. And then the practice is what is defined by management. So when do you meet? Do you use Jira? How exactly do you share information? In a community, on the other hand, the agency is handed to the people who show up. So we actually have the decision of what is the domain? Well, whoever showed up kind of made that decision, didn't they? We decide what the topic actually is, what the knowledge that we're there to share. How do we select who's there? It's the people who show up, the people who make the decision to actually be there and sit in a room and share knowledge and participate. And then the definition of practice, we do kind of hand this off to somebody. We have organizing teams for DevOps days. Whoever creates the Slack channel kind of makes it happen. But then everything else just happens organically. So that's the difference between a community of practice and a team. Now there's also the community itself. A community of practice is not, a community is not necessarily a community of practice. The best example is your neighborhood. There's not really a domain that you're sharing about when it comes to your neighborhood. Now, before you think it, next door doesn't count. Just to be clear, we're talking about a domain of knowledge, not necessarily what happened last night down the street. Now, you might have, let's say, a gardening group that's part of your neighborhood. That could be a community of practice because you're sharing knowledge about a specific domain. Again, that passion matters. I'm not really sure anybody here has a huge passion about what happens on their street after 5 p.m. Maybe you do, and I'm not judging. So now that we know what a community of practice is and what a community of practice is not, let's talk about our DevOps community. And I'm going to keep saying community, assume I mean community of practice. Because by definition, the DevOps community is a community of practice. We have a whole set of knowledge that we're sharing. The knowledge of what DevOps is lives in things like DevOps days, like your local meetups, the working group at your organization. Every DevOps community is really a community of practice. Now, we do have subgroups, right? There's all these tiny little groups of different domains. And there's fuzzy boundaries between those domains, right? We've got infrastructure, QA, observability, automation, CI/CD, Agile, Lean, Scrum. I had to make the list to make sure I got everybody because I know if I don't say someone, they're going to come to find me afterwards and say, hey, you forgot me. Networking is in there too. Someone I know is going to come bug me about that later. But because we have so many subgroups and there's so many fuzzy boundaries, inevitably we run into conflict. Sometimes this is direct conflict about which topic is more important, which one should have more time at a meetup or DevOps days or our local group. Sometimes it's a conflict around, well, I don't think I really need to hear from you because I don't really care about QA or I don't care about networking because it doesn't affect my job. I'm putting that in big quotes. Sometimes it's about funding if it's within your organization too. Sometimes it's not so direct. Like I said, when you're actually sharing knowledge and you're not so sure that it's worth sitting in on that talk versus a different talk. There's even conflict when simply defining what the term DevOps means, right? You get the people who believe it's a culture, the people who believe it's tooling, the people who believe, I don't know, hopefully no one here believes DevOps is the flying spaghetti monster, right? But the idea here is that because there is so much conflict and because we identify with different subgroups, we naturally assimilate those conflicts as our own. And we start finding those conflicts in our organization. The key to get through that, though, as part of the DevOps community, is finding common threads. DevOps is about people coming together to share about the things they know and want to know in the broad space of development and operations and everything in the life cycle of an idea, from conception to obsolescence. That includes security, that includes data, pretty much all of the various threads that contribute to that life cycle. We have a desire to work together. We have a desire to share knowledge and all of those cultural aspects that go with it. We want to measure what we're doing. This might sound familiar, especially if you just watch the Ignites. COMS, which stands for culture or collaboration, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing, is really a measurement of what a community of practice is. Especially that sharing part at the end. Remember, that's like the third pillar. That is the practice of being part of a community of practice. So that's great, right? What does this matter to us, though? How do we get to DevOps? Now, there's a friend of mine named Matty Stratton. You'll hear him say, I can sell you DevOps, right? But DevOps really isn't something that you really buy. It's something that you earn. It's something that you gather and find. So how do we bring that to any organization? Whether you are just bringing it to your team or you're bringing it out to an entire company. First things first, you start out from the bottom up. DevOps isn't defined by a leadership group. It's not one person who comes in and says, we're doing the DevOps. No. Just like any community of practice, remember, communities of practice aren't defined by leadership. They're defined by the people who show up, the people who have that passion and they care and they want to make a change. It isn't mandated and just suddenly magically just works. It takes a grassroots mindset change because a community of practice is defined by the people who show up. And by the way, this is why it doesn't work. If you were to take the practices that you learned at one organization and try to shoehorn it into another organization, because the environment is different. The people who show up are different. And you need to define what that is. Speaking of defining boundaries, part of actually having a successful community of practice is defining the boundaries around your domain. What do you, as the group who showed up, think DevOps is? Okay, work within those bounds. Because that's how you get everyone on board and passionate enough to go do it. You also need to convince others. Now, part of it is bringing the right people together. One of the many things I did long ago was working with teachers in a literacy classroom. But these were teachers who did career and technical education. There were quite a few of them who said to me, you know, I don't think I should be here. I don't think anybody's going to listen to me. So part of my job was convincing them that, yeah, you're part of this community of practice. It's really important that you're here. You're providing a perspective that some other people don't have. So in that case, once I was able to convince them to show up, we had a conversation because there were multiple points of view. There were multiple people being engaged, and they had a passion for what's going on. Now, sometimes you also have to convince other people, like your leadership, that, maybe we should get off Teams and go to Slack and have these spaces that people can create things. I may be a little bitter, it's okay. But that being said, part of the convincing is also convincing your leadership to let you make these spaces for everyone to participate. Convincing leadership that you should be here. So, in doing so, sometimes you need to make analogies with other verticals. I mean, business people go to conferences too. They have conversations, they learn from other people. So all of this convincing that you're going to have to do is part of gathering together your community of practice and bringing DevOps to your organization. Once you've convinced people to show up, part of it also is connecting others. So that really is part of building up a community of practice. By connecting one person's idea to another person's idea, you start to build up that domain. You start to encourage more discussion. They start to bring in more people. You start to get that group, that community, the relationships and interactions among a group of people. And then from there, you need to make space. Part of it is providing that infrastructure, whether that's a DevOps Days, or it's an internal developer conference, or it's a Slack channel. Those are the actual spaces, but you also need to make mental space. That's convincing others that, hey, yeah, I know you don't really think that QA is part of your world, but it is. Let's talk about why. Let's make that space in your mind so that when you talk to the next person, they believe you. And they want to be part of the community of practice. Once you've finally brought all these diverse points of view together, you've got the group of people that have the interaction, they have the passion, they have the interest to be there, they want to share their knowledge. You then need to finally unify all these points of view. It should be a lot easier if you've spent the time defining the boundaries, building it from the bottom up, going through and making the connections and convincing others to be there, and making that space. Because once you have that point of view all together, it's a lot easier to get leadership on board with you. Now, I know this is pretty academic. All that being said, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, it's this. At the heart of DevOps is a community, but it's driven by you, the practitioners. You showing up, you being there, being engaged. You can change the thought patterns in your organization to bring about a DevOps cultural shift by driving toward a strong community of practice. You can help build local communities of practice by being engaged with your local meetups, asking questions. You don't necessarily have to be up here speaking, though you can. Trust me, it's not as scary as it seems. But even just sitting here, paying attention, asking questions afterwards, coming and talking to a speaker afterwards, all of those things are part of building up your local community of practice. DevOps communities of practice are defined by the people who show up. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you for having me. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, had some thoughts in there. I will take some feedback if you want to scan that QR code. There's a feedback form. Hopefully it turned on. But on that note, I'm happy to take any questions.
So we have a few minutes if anyone has any questions. Oh, there we go.
Hey, questions. Awesome. I love questions. I also ran through that a little faster than I expected.
So in that next to last slide, you were talking a little bit about the importance of getting on the same page. And let's see.
This one?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
One of the things, I'm studying teams in graduate school, and one of the things that surprised me was that there will be teams that are goal aligned, and there will be teams that are goal diverse, and both have the potential to be high performing, depending on how leadership evolves within the team or outside the team. But also, not only do they have that opportunity to be high performing, but one particular team is better at creativity and innovation, and the other is better at repetitive task-oriented type roles.
Right.
And it was a real surprise to me that it was the goal diverse group. When they have great leadership that can channel their energy and try to get them in line with the organization's goals, those folks think outside the box and have lots of creative ideas versus the other group. Do you have any experience seeing that in practice? Does that speak to your ideas of how to build that community of practice?
I think so. I mean, you have to remember that the goals are defined by the business, more so by than the group that's there. If they have if they're sharing all of that knowledge together, it's a lot easier to meet a diverse group of goals. Whereas if everybody's trying to meet the same thing, it's a lot easier to get into conflict when you have, let's say, oh, I think we should go this way. Oh, I think we should go this way. And if we have those discussions constantly, even though we might be sharing knowledge, there's that disconnect of which way do we go? How do we solve this problem? But if you have a whole group of people solving a whole wide group of problems, but they're sharing knowledge about, oh yeah, I figured out that if we do this on Jenkins, and I'm going to use Jenkins a lot just because I have it. If we do this on Jenkins, it works for this. Oh, I found it works for this too. And so they can build up that knowledge together to solve a much more wider group of problems in a creative way. I don't know. I've always found that if you narrow down too far onto one thing, it's a lot harder to get creative and think outside the box. Whereas if everybody else is talking about, oh, well, I'm trying to fix this weird server bug that only happens at 11:59 p.m. on the third Tuesday of the month, and then this person over here is talking about how they're, trying to build up the performance of their application and it's stuck somewhere. Sometimes you find really interesting things that are across that. So a good leader who can bridge those diverse points of view and build that together is probably going to do a lot better. So that's my personal take on it. I have seen it that way, but I think it kind of depends on where you are.
Any other questions? Oh. Making me run. Making me run.
I just wanted to ask, it seems to me that the community of practice, when you say business helps to mold it, that they also have to set up shared rewards to get the teams to look together, because if you have different reward systems and different groups, it doesn't matter what they say, they're all going to shoot for the prize that gives them the greatest reward.
Right.
Money talks.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely part of that making space, right? So that if people believe that they want to be there and all of that, if you're making the space for them, not just like physical spaces, but also that mental space, but also the financial space to make it actually happen, people are more likely to show up. It's not a if you build it, they will come, because I don't really believe in that. Let's be honest, but it's definitely there. Yeah.
I have a question for the audience.
Oh, boy.
How many here are the leaders of a community of practice within, well, your communities or your organizations or your companies?
Hey, all right, okay.
How do we enable for the other people that didn't raise their hands? Or I guess the other question is, how many folks are in those community practices and those leaders aren't here today? Maybe because, or if they're in this area, but does that make sense?
You're allowed to raise your hand. If your boss is not here and you're trying to shame them, go ahead, raise your hand high.
Yeah, so we would.
Yeah, the camera's pointed at me, by the way, not you.
We would, like, because of the DevOps Days, kind of how it's run, volunteer, et cetera, we don't have like a corporate agenda, if you will. However, we do like to know what we can do as a community better to attract the right kinds of folks, both grassroots and your executives and the folks that pay your bills or whatever. How do we get them here for subsequent events? So if you have any ideas around that, what topics, that would be great.
So I have to admit, this talk actually was originally written for DevOps Days Houston as a keynote there, but part of it was also the idea that I knew their community needed help rebuilding, right? So part of it is encouraging everybody to show up that their voices are heard. That's that making space, bringing the diverse points of view, convincing others that it's worth them being there. So maybe somebody might want to like propose an open space about engineering leadership and maybe send like a picture to their boss and say like, hey, you missed this, even if we don't actually do it. But I'm just saying, like, if you're making the space for them and saying like, hey, it's not just here, let me show you how to go through, and I'm going to pick on Marino, hopefully he won't hate me. Here, it's not just about like, you know, building up your edge network with a service mesh, right? Like, because I have to admit, any engineering manager who is like, isn't really techie, they're kind of sit there like, deer in headlights, help me. But if you kind of give them that space of, let's talk about DevOps management or engineering management or anything along that line, or let's talk about the metrics side or things like that. Encouraging them to come and talk about that too is also really helpful.
Yeah.
So, but remember, it's about the people who show up.
Yep.
So if they don't show up, they're kind of missing out.
Yep.
Maybe that's just me.
All right. Any more questions? Oh,
I love having questions after a talk. This is great.
Not really a question. Just want to guess raise awareness.
Yeah.
Just piggyback on what you mentioned before. I am a DevOps engineering manager.
Uh-huh.
So I am actually a manager. I showed
Yay!
up.
You showed up! Yay!
Right. So I'll be more than happy to collaborate on, you know, enabling the community to come together and talk,
Yeah.
you know, with leadership and management. Just because being here helps me make the proper decisions for my team, so they can feel fulfilled and happy working within the company and, you know, within the team that I manage.
Absolutely,
So-
absolutely. So now you know, like, so we can quote you, right? So maybe we can put like your little testimonial quote.
Hey, I like I said, I'd be more than happy to help grow the community here and
Yeah.
just wider, on a wider scale.
Let me ask this: how many people here are part of a local meetup? How many people here did not know there were local meetups? It's okay to admit it. That's all right. Maybe we need to figure out a better way to reach everybody. Because I admit, like in Austin, I know right now we've been using Meetup for over 10 years. And we found out that like half of the community didn't even know that Meetup existed.
yeah.
So they're finding it out through word of mouth more than anything else. But there's always the tooling question too. I guess that's really an analogy for DevOps, right? We talk about the culture, and then if the tools don't work, whoops.
Yeah. Oh.
Sorry, I'm making you run.
It's all good. Got to burn those calories.
I'd share with everybody that there was a book I found last year at the Agile 2022 conference in Nashville called The Agile Community by Alex Slowly. And it's a book about how do you create a community at work, how do you create a community in your community,
Yep.
how do you end up becoming a conference volunteer, how you end up becoming a conference leader, how you end up starting your own conference. He goes there.
Yeah.
I thought that it's not a very long read. It's an excellent book, again by Alex Slowly, Sloley, called The Agile Community, and it's a cookbook for this.
Yeah, excellent. That's good to know. We only have just like a minute, so I just want to kind of close. I'm going to be around the whole conference. Come find me. Come ask questions. Come discuss. All of that. That's why I'm here. But I guess the one thing I just want to remind you is, like, if you don't know about your local meetups, it's okay to ask. If you don't know about your local communities, it's okay to ask. This is how we grow. This is how we do better at DevOps or any other tech that you're interested in. Because if we're not sharing what we learned, it's like that Stack Overflow post from 10 years ago when you discover that someone else had the same exact question, but you never know what their answer is. I unfortunately do not have the obligatory XKCD, but I'm sure most of you are currently thinking of that.
Yes. All right, one more round of applause for Laura. Thank you so much.